It'll take a minute.
Now, where did you go? Launch meeting room. Well, we're already in the meeting room. Oh, there you are. I will maximize this screen. And my brightness is good. I'm not too dark. I'm not too bright. Not too well lit. Everything is within reason.
I think so. What do you think, Nate?
Looks good to me from here. Yeah.
Great.
All right, awesome. It looks like we are. Well, we'll better turn this off. All right, we are live to the world. Welcome everybody to Aeon Byte Live. And of course, we'll let people go into the chat room. And welcome to the desert of the real, everybody. Let me make sure everything's working on my end. I've got 1,000 things going here. Awesome. Well, with us, we have, first of all, we've got the occult fan himself back at the Virtual Alexandria to help out. How you doing, Nate? Thanks for being here.
Hey, Miguel. Thank you so much for having me on.
Always good to have you, my friend. And also, we've got back after a pretty long pause. I think it was, I just looked at when we did our first podcast, October 7th, 2015. Man, time just flies. But James, we've got James Bean. James,
namaste.
Back.
Yeah, nice to be back.
Yeah, great to have you back after such a long pause. So it's going to be good. And again, we covered a lot of ground in our last interview many moons ago. So I'm sure since then, James probably has more research he wants to share, especially if we can cover some of the vegetarian tendencies of later Gnostics like the Manichaeans, excuse me, and the Cathars and all that good stuff, and what more evidence we have as there's more insights on these texts, and still a lot of work to be done with these texts. So for a little house cleaning, for those of you live there, if you have questions for James, please try to put a lot of question marks at the end or write them in caps. Occult Fan and I will try to glean your questions for James. And if you have a super chat, of course, you will get put at the top of the queue, if you would. Did I lose you, Nate?
I'm seeing him speaking into a microphone.
You're on mute, dude.
Yeah, we have a lot of feedback from.
Did I lose you, Nate?
No, everything's. Yeah, see, it's going on some feedback right now.
Seeing him speaking into a microphone.
I think, do you have yours under? I think yours needs to be on mute. What about you guys there at the chat room? How do we sound?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I think we sound okay. It might be, you might have to put one of yours on mute there. Yeah, I see on chat. Sorry about that.
So we don't get a repeat sound loop.
Yeah. If there is a feedback, guys, in the chat room, let us know, and we will jump and fix these technical issues. But I think everything sounds fine. Nobody's saying anything in the chat room. So all good. So anyway, where was it? Yes, if you have questions, please put them on caps, put some question marks at the end. Super chats will be up at the queue. We want to keep this into a historical perspective, or maybe as James's perspective on his life. We don't want to get into any debates. If you want to debate about veganism or meat eating or vegetarian, feel free to go at it in the chat room. But this is not really a social, you might say, discussion, if you would, or debate. This is simply sharing some awesome historical fact about these ancient esoteric movements and what they did and everything else. So other than that, let's get started. For those, again, October 7th, 2015. And that's interesting, James, because back then, I was not a full vegetarian. And even today, I'm a full vegetarian, but once in a while, I will eat shrimp, I will eat fish. but for the most part, I completely stay away from chicken, pork, or beef. And my decision in 2015 was basically as a protest against the horrible treatment of animals in our corporatized food mass-produced system. And of course, I watched the videos and all that. And of course, it was more of a feeling. It was being at a restaurant here in Chicago, and that's where everything was meat. And I had one of those mystic experiences where I could feel almost the pain of these animals. And it was my wife, and she still eat meats, but she told me basically, if what does the Gospel of Thomas says, it's not what you put in your mouth that will defile you, what comes out of your mouth. But I feel if you put violence in your mouth, it's probably better not to do so. And I feel if we are, as I get older, I realize as humans, we are sensitive. We absorb what is around you, sort of with algorithms or epigenetic systems. And I feel that we are absorbing the pain and suffering of these animals, and it does affect them. And I feel definitely more peaceful. But at the time that I talked to you, James, I wasn't a full vegetarian. It was one of those things where I started, I'm not going to eat meat on Sundays. I'm not going to eat meat on Friday. And then I sort of incrementally, so by that Christmas 2015, I was fully vegetarian.
It's usually a transition for most. Yeah, kind of a transition. I was kosher before I was veg, and then I was vegan after being veg for a while,
Yes. And I know one of these days I will have to face perhaps going vegan. Again, it's something I'm trying to think. I think I like to follow Mark Passio, who's kind of this badass anarchist, and he walks around with his guns and all that, and he's a vegan, and he's basically made a very good case that you can switch to veganism and still be very healthy, athletic, and all that. And of course, there's many examples. Cory Booker, there's NBA stars, football stars who are vegan. But enough of my drivel, as I say. Tell us about your journey into vegetarianism and the esoteric itself.
And Ted Nugent's son, ironically, is vegan, and that's kind of fun. I find that fun,
Well, we always rebel against our parents.
Exactly, and that's a spectacular example there. Well, as I mentioned in the original Aeon Byte interview, I got to become the heretic I am today by reading the New Testament book of Jude. And in Jude quotes the book of First Enoch, chapter 1, and was like, whoa, this is not in the table of contents of the Old Testament. And so from there, I started collecting these writings, apocryphal writings, Dead Sea Scrolls, and then the Nag Hammadi Library came out. And so before you know it, I was reading, Buddha Sutras and Upanishads, and it just kept on going, collecting scriptures and texts and things. And so, but that makes you, by definition, a kind of heretic just to know about Gospel of Thomas and Odes of Solomon and Trimorphic Proto-Noah, which is a fun name. And so just to know about the existence of alternate Christianities and Judaism, Sethians and Valentinians and Manichaeans, puts you at odds with orthodoxy and the accepted Sunday school view of the King James Version dropping from the sky, getting caught by King James, direct from God, or caught by early apostles, as the case may be. And so it's just this mind-blowing exploration of the, alternative views of mysticism and prayer and diet, that we're focusing on this evening. Just the unaccepted, not the mainstream views, not the Sunday school notions, the carnism that we inherit, the expected beliefs, that all goes out the window, as we explore the apocryphal and the extra canonical.
That indeed, it opens a whole new vistas of possibilities and what was going on. And yes, and as we talked about in our last interview, you are a practitioner of Sant Mat and Gnosticism, and they both are very complementary.
Same thing.
You're in fact, you're not alone in this. I mean,
Right.
other guests have, from scholars like Robert Price to guests, have said it's pretty much the same thing. So maybe briefly tell the audience what are the parallels, and obviously how it works out so well for you, because you're not really making a choice.
Right. For me, Gnostics were just an earlier batch of mystics, another branch of the mystic tree, kind of like the Kabbalah saints and the Sufis, and there's the saints of India. And so it's just this long apostolic succession or lineage, and actually a whole family tree of mystic schools of spirituality and their lineages going back. And so the Gnostics are just a bit further back there. And they had an esoteric, they're part of the esoteric tradition. So they have a spiritual practice, which is kind of a secret thing, secret names of God, like those four lights and the names mentioned in trimorphic proto-Noah. There's El Elith, and I forget some of the others. There are the four lights, and it totals to 5 names, kind of Hebrew sounding names in certain Sethian texts, and that was their mantra. And each of those names corresponds with a heavenly realm. And for them to chant those names would be a way to outrank and defeat the archons and ascend. So sort of like passwords to higher regions and so on. And so Saint Maud is very much all about that ascension of the soul through the planes back to the nameless one, the nameless God in the 8th plane. And in some Gnostic texts, there's reference to the 8th and the nameless God, the one who has no name. Gospel of Judas has a reference to that.
Nothing about a horse with no name, but there is a God with no name.
That's right. The God that's given many names is nameless at the same time. So yeah, it's an esoteric system, and it has teachers, lineages of masters, and there are Saint Maud books on Gnosticism and mystical Christianity. The Gospel of Jesus in Search of His Original Teachings by John Davidson, who also wrote a book on the Odes of Solomon and the Robe of Glory and a bunch of other texts. So yeah, it's an interesting, the Gnostic Mystery by Andrea Diem Lane is another one about the Gnostics and Saint Maud parallels. Meditation, other dimensions, vegetarianism, an initiation into the mysteries, which is sort of a secret thing, but it's really just a meditation practice, transcending the world of the flesh. And through the single eye or third eye, entering into inner space and becoming an off-worlder, if we can, to some degree, one degree or another. Sort of an attempt at a conscious near-death experience, only a little more tame, a little more gradual, if you will. And yeah, vegetarianism is part of that. And I think for the Gnostics, it was transcending the flesh and the material plane. But they got it from the Pythagoreans, and I think the Essenes were influenced by the Pythagoreans, and the early Christians were the grandkids of the Essenes within Judaism. So yeah, all of these paths are connected. Keith Akers, who wrote a book about original Christianity, says that Ebionite Jewish Christianity kind of eventually morphed into the Sufis of Islam, and that's where they ended up. And he quotes some text that says Rabia of Basra was a vegetarian, and actually I found some vegan verses of Rumi, the king of the great Sufi poets, and was specifically saying that he abstained from milk as well as meat. So that puts him into the vegan camp. So yeah, esoteric Judaism kind of morphed into Sufism at some point. I think Gnostic systems can adapt to different theologies. Okay, God is a Trinity now. Okay, we can work with that. Allah, all right, Allah is the seal of the prophets, or maybe Hermes Trismegistus. You know, there are different names, but the system is pretty much the same, just different person, you know, Seth or Jesus or Allah, Trinity, you know, but the same esoterica kind of underneath, the same Linux operating system, no matter what the distribution is, Ubuntu or Linux or Mint or, you know, one of the others. Same operating system.
Yeah, I like that. And excuse me, you know, I do not have the coronavirus. Just because I coughed, I'm not stocking on toilet paper. I don't know why everybody's stocking on toilet paper.
Getting ready for the apocalypse. Yes.
Yeah, the zombie. Well, you
That's
should
good for our business, though. The podcast world will all be at home, self-isolating, trying to not get the virus, and that means we'll be on the internet.
There you go. It's always great for us introverts. A good time for us. We've been preparing this for all of our lives, to be in a room talking to others.
Listening to podcasts, reading books, and meditating, and ordering from Amazon toilet paper, as it were. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. And I saw a question, a super chat for 100th Monkey. I will get to you. We'll talk more or less about diet later on, but we want to keep it historical for now so we get the origins. But before that,
Right.
James, what in Saint Mat, you don't have the sort of visceral rejection of matter and the gods of this world and the sort of anarchic thrusts that you do with the Sethians and the Ophites and the Manichaeans, do you? Is it more non-dualistic?
Well, it's there, but I'm not really quite clear on what it was, how that was like in Gnosticism as a historic path. In terms of meditation practice, it's about tuning out the outer world and going within. So that is how that is viewed. Now, whether the Valentinians, when they said reject the world and, you know, rise above, if that's what they meant, or, I mean, cult groups can go in weird directions with that. You know, they can just, you know, want to build some secret commune in the wilderness or something, and that's their rejecting of the world. In terms of meditation, you know, that's really all it is. It's just temporarily tuning out the world of the five senses and kind of creating your own sensory deprivation situation, dimly lit room, quiet, dark environment, soul travel, out of body, you know, excursions. So that, by definition, is sort of a temporary rejecting of the world and the five senses, and in order to explore inner space. It's kind of like astronomy. You take the lens off the telescope and you point in this direction and look for that heavenly light from beyond. And that's kind of like mysticism, really. Only the third eye is the lens to be looked through. But yeah, there's not really an antisocial aspect. Some paths are, I mean, certain Gnostic texts made it seem like they hated matter and hated the world. But I don't know if they really were like that, or if that was just a theological, metaphysical.
It was a mythological. I mean, if you look at history, the early Christians and the more intense Jews were far more they broke more laws. They were more aesthetic. The Gnostics, as we look, they were part of the universities. They were part of culture. There was, again, I think they were just more politically anarchist, and they were more I guess, descriptive in their mythology, if you would.
Yeah, some were debating with Plotinus there, and so I think they were around. I think in the case of the Nag Hammadi people, I think my theory of the Nag Hammadi is that you have a bunch of these Valentinian Gnostics carrying scriptures with them, and they really love the idea of joining Saint Pachomius's monastic communities. And so they just brought their Gnostic scriptures with them and liked the idea of this intentional community in the desert. So that's a kind of a rejection of the world to move into a monastery. And I think that's where some of those Nag Hammadi texts came from, actually, how they got to Nag Hammadi. And so that's one thing. But mostly in Sant-Mat, people just live their ordinary lives, workaday world situations, and don't move into an ashram. Now, there are some ashrams, but they tend to be places of meeting, not really where everyone moves into. Like a monastery would be in Christianity, or those interesting Pacomian monasteries of 4th century Egypt that we associate with texts, copying of ancient manuscripts.
Indeed, yes, and of course the rebellion really starts with your ideas in your heart, not going around breaking things or breaking the law or all that. So I think that's the Gnostics were certainly controversial. They were disliked, they were persecuted, but it was because of their ideas were so radical, and you couldn't spread these ideas about, as you say, inner light, freedom of the individual, finding your own God that beyond all the other gods. So I think that's what happened.
Yeah, they hated everyone back then. Yeah, the Orthodox Christianity made it illegal to be anything other than Orthodox Christian. So it was illegal to copy documents. It was illegal to assemble. So Epiphanius, he didn't like the Ebionites. He didn't like the Valentinians. He didn't like. He wrote like 4 or 5 volumes against every possible religion of the Roman Empire that he could name, and said bad things about them. So yeah, they didn't really. Orthodox Christianity didn't like other groups existing. And some of them were kind of on the Catholic side, like the Cathars of France were not really all that different from the Catholics, really. I mean, some of those folks that were burnt at the stake. Who was that? Marguerite Perret, who authored that book, The Mirror of Simple Souls. I mean, this person would pass for a Catholic these days. They just cross their T's slightly differently. But in earlier times, they were this terrible heretic, and I think the Valentinians probably would fit into almost Catholicism in a way. They had their own mass, I guess. So, just slightly different, than the mainstream. But
yeah, but I think the Gnostics certainly were rejected, not just by the Catholics, but the Persian Empire came down upon many.
yes,
Islam has come down upon the Gnostics, the Pagans, when they went to
yes,
Asia. So
yes,
there's just something the Sufis have suffered against their own, within their own religion. They've gotten their asses. So
absolutely.
there's something about the Gnostic spirit that just really ticks people off. So
yeah, Mani almost had a world religion at one point, from west to east, if you want to count the Cathars of France, all the way to China. And if they had no concept of freedom of religion or human rights, no Amnesty International, and so if the emperor or the king, the monarch, likes you, then you get to flourish and be funded by the state. And then he kicks off and then is replaced by someone else, and he don't like you at all. And all of a sudden, that's right, then you are eradicated from existence, persecuted, and all that's left are some archaeological digs and, the turfin fragments and some bones and buried, jars with writings inside. No next of kin, they're all gone. The Gnostics are like annihilated, in Egypt, and the Manichaeans were sort of dismembered all the way to China sooner or later. The favorable kings died off and were replaced by hostile forces. And so, now they're mostly gone. I guess there are a few Manichaeans still hanging on in India.
I've heard the same thing. There is
Couple, 2 or 3, yeah.
2 or 3.
A few.
Together with a few hundred Zoroastrians.
yeah. I think India has a few Manichaeans, a few Manichaean shrines, and left over. And there's some interesting remains in China. I don't know about living Manichaeans, but there are these writings, the Jesus Sutras, that have been written about that are by this group called the Church of the Light, which is actually a very Manichaean name. And they were like a composite of Manichaean and Nestorian, Taoist and Buddhist all in one. Their writings are pretty fascinating too. There's a book called the Jesus Sutras, which is, and they were a vegetarian religion.
Yeah, I've read it. You think it's authentic, or
Oh yeah, there was a group there. Yeah, I think their
what
name
time?
was
Around what time?
the 7th
That
century.
early?
Yep,
Wow. Wow.
7th and 8th century. Supposedly started by Syrians, and well, everybody along the Silk Road, came. There were Manichaeans, there were Nestorians, Syrian Christian missionaries. And so I think they all kind of amalgamated into this group in China called the Church of the Light, or the Daqian, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they had their own gospels as well. And it's kind of like, well, I think Thomas Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh would have really liked their stuff because it's this Buddhist Christian fusion or hybrid.
Oh yeah, I would agree too. I mean, of course, and then you've got the sayings of Jesus in Islam, which are great, much
Yeah,
more dualistic, very
yeah,
intense. So, yeah, this wisdom's all over the place. So, why don't we get to vegetarianism in ancient
vegetarianism.
time? I'm
Yes.
sure most people would assume rightly that in the West, it really began with Pythagoras and his movement. Of course, you mentioned it is true the Gnostics were called the sons and daughters of Pythagoras. So were many of the other aesthetic groups.
Right.
And the cult of Orpheus, is that where it started? And why was it started? Why did these individuals decide to renounce meat?
Well, I think that there's a case to be made that Pythagoras was influenced by Eastern thought, might have been a student of an Eastern teacher. And there's a slight influence of Upanishads. Some have tried to suggest there's a slight parallels with certain Upanishads, and who knows what was at the Library of Alexandria. Uh, so in any case, yeah, they had a pretty well developed, the West has always tried to have a developed system or school, and then it gets wiped out or bad things happen and it gets rebooted too soon. But Pythagoras, yes, was vegetarian, and the Pythagoreans were vegetarians and were a big influence on all of these groups, the Essenes, the Hermetic philosophy, Judaism, Christianity, Gnosticism. In the Nag Hammadi, there is a book called The Sentences of Sextus, and the full name is The Sentences of Sextus the Pythagorean. And there are other books out there that have the whole collection of the Sentences of Sextus. And that's a Pythagorean holy book, or piece of a Pythagorean text in the Nag Hammadi. So they were, I think, without Pythagoreanism, you wouldn't have the vegetarianism of the Jewish tradition, the Essenes. I think they were very influenced by Greek thought, and especially Pythagoras. Pythagoreanism was against animal sacrifice, and that was kind of intertwined, not only vegetarianism, but against animal ritual sacrifice. And of course, that became a huge tenet of Essene Judaism. And their grandkids, the Ebionites, or Jesus movement, they were very opposed to the Jewish temple doing animal sacrifices. And that was a big thing, that big dispute with Paul versus the Jesus movement. They were arguing as early as 50 AD about vegetarianism and whether it's okay to eat animals that had been sacrificed in pagan temples. And so that was like a big deal back then. Paul was arguing with vegetarian Christians in his letters, and that means the Jesus movement, that original group. He was arguing with the original group, or Christianity before Paul, as I call it. They also have been called the poor, or Ebionites, Nazarenes, Uh, Eventually, there's a group or splinter off of them called the Elkosites, and the prophet Mani grew up in an Elkosite household. And so that's vegetarianism, Sabbath keeping, and, kind of a Jewish Christian orientation that he inherited. Um, so yeah,
James, let's
go ahead.
back up for a second.
Yep.
And it should be mentioned too, I don't know if there's a line to follow here, but Pythagoras did spend time, I think, in Persia. And of course, he was deputized by a shaman. Obviously, in Zoroastrianism, it's completely against animal sacrifice. I don't know if there is a vegetarian movement, but it's something to check. So, I mean, again, we're speculating a lot, but
Yeah, as far as where he got his teachings from, because Pythagoras believed in reincarnation and was
that's a good reason for because you might be eating your family next to your ancestors.
Right, exactly. Yes. Yes.
So that's a good point. But this is different. I understand that the cult of Orpheus and Pythagoras, it was really about compassion, the idea of reincarnation and breaking through the cycle of death and suffering and just kind of being outside. But in Judaism, you're talking about James and a lot of the first, you might say, Jewish Christians.
Yeah.
Was that the reason? Because I think I've read that James, the brother of the Lord, was vegetarian because they were afraid, he and his group, they were afraid of preparing the meat wrong for Jehovah, or again, it might have been touched by pagans or been offered to a pagan god. It was more to do with the laws of Moses than anything.
I'm not really sure if there was a narrow reason for it. They seem to be completely vegetarian and not kosher. And the Essenes that they were close to, I think of early Christianity as being very close to Essene Judaism. They both liked the book of First Enoch and were messianic. And there are different messiahs that some people chose. There's more than one messiah to choose from back then. But the Jewish Christians are messianic, read the book of Enoch, and were very close to the Essenes, who are not really criticized in the New Testament, like those Sadducees and Pharisees were. They were the bad guys. And so that's kind of an Essene orientation. Although I must say that I don't think of the early Christians as being Essene. I know there are some neo-Essene vegetarian groups out there, and they kind of use the word Essene to cover everybody, different Christian groups too. They put under that label, which I don't. I tend to think of the Jesus movement as the Ebionites, and that the Ebionite-ism and Nazareanism came out of Essene Judaism, that they became separate sects within Judaism, even as Essenism is sort of a separate sect, a bigger separate sect of Judaism.
And the Therapeutae, do you see them as the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, or what's your view? Because it gets confusing.
Yeah, they were a vegetarian group too. Philo of Alexandria writes about the Therapeutae, where we get the word healer from. They had this co-ed monastery, intentional community out in near a lake near Alexandria, Egypt, and I think that's the first instance that the word monastery, the Greek word for monastery, was used for a particular group, not a Christian monastery, but a Jewish sect practicing monasticism. Alexandria. They were vegetarians. Philo gives a description of their lifestyle, how they had separate huts and were kind of like hermits, but would come together on the Sabbath for a communal gathering and meals. And he described them as being vegetarian. And I think of the Therapeutae as probably being another name for Essene, perhaps a Egyptian branch of Essenism, but the same idea, a community near a big lake, or in the case of Qumran, you have the Dead Sea, and that group there at Qumran. We have writings from the Essenes of Qumran, but don't really have much of a description of what went on there. But in the case of the Therapeutae, we have descriptions of their lifestyle, but not their writings. Philo said they had writings besides the Old Testament or Torah that they used, but we don't really have any discovery site where texts have turned up. But yeah, they're a vegetarian group, probably Essene or some cousin of the Essenes. They're in near Alexandria, Egypt.
Awesome. Well said. And Nate, do you have a question for James, or anything from the chat room?
There's a few, Miguel. There was the super chat question, which was super relevant, but there's a few others that have been asked. I'll give you one or two of them. So one of the really interesting ones was, what about the reopening of the third temple in Jerusalem demands animal sacrifice? Asked by Chad Warren. And there's another question here. This is more, this is very cool. Logoi Library asks, what are people's thoughts on different races' genetic makeups being able to benefit or not benefit from either being vegetarian or eating meat? And I think I'd extend that to the blood types and just different types of people across the world. And there was one more general question about Valentinius, the first to come up with the doctrine of the Trinity, and that was Ben. So that's all I got for you, Miguel.
All right. Well, for Valentinus, that is Eusebius who says, which is always strange because they spent these centuries lambasting the Gnostics, but then Eusebius goes, oh, and Valentinus came with the doctrine of the Trinity. He's like, well, you just support one of your greatest theologies came from a damn heretic. So,
Right.
but it's Eusebius. You got to take him with a grain of salt. But any of those questions you want to address, James?
The blood type thing, I think, was declared to be a myth. There was a popular book that was written that I think has been written off as not accurate about, if you're a certain blood type, you can't be veg or something like that. Opening the new temple and having the return of sacrifices in like a third Jewish temple, that's going to be can we say shit show here?
It's not gonna fly well.
Yeah, I just have this apocalyptic dystopian view of that whole scene.
Yeah, why don't you just let the Aztecs restart sacrifice in Mexico City? Yeah, while we're at it. So
yeah, I think the Middle East is sort of dystopian on a full-time basis on a good day. And I can't imagine what life will be like if they're doing that. That's like quite a war between Judaism and Islam, which it already is. So I can't imagine what that will be like to turn the temperature up higher in Jerusalem on the dome of the rock there. I did want to mention a few things about the early Jesus movement and the Gospel of Thomas, just kind of put together like a little brief synopsis.
Sure. Yeah. First, would you mind answering? So Paul, is Paul, I've heard that Paul might have been vegetarian. I mean, he wasn't telling people he was vegetarian but he himself might have been vegetarian. Have you heard anything about that, James?
Well, yeah, I do have an opinion on that because the Gnostics liked Paul. Elaine Pagels wrote this book, The Gnostic Paul. And so they did not think of Paul as an adversary, a pro-meat kind of guy. He was their saint. I mean, a lot Gnostics like Paul. So I think I've given this a lot of thought. I think Paul's disagreement with the original disciples led by James the Just, I think it was about an approach to spread Christianity. And I think Paul had kind of an early version of what the Manichaeans eventually were practicing, where you have new converts who have a looser ethical code, not really worrying about diet so much. The new converts part of the outer circle of believers,
The hearers.
the
And then
hearers
inside
of
was
the
the
word.
perfects.
Yes. And then there is an inner circle of initiates being perfected in gnosis and wisdom, and they were vegetarian. I think that was his format. That's what you have in Manichaean Gnosticism eventually. And I think that was what he wanted to do, have more of a mystery school approach to it. Whereas the Jerusalem group says one thing for everybody, become vegetarian, and they didn't have this outer circle, inner circle kind of distinction. So I think in that sense, we can maybe sign up Paul for the vegetarian cause in that sense, because the Gnostics liked Paul. For them, he was not the adversary, and they didn't have any quarrel with him. So I think that same inner outer format you find discussed in the secret gospel of Mark saga, that there was a secret gospel of Mark
Right.
for the initiates. And Clement of Alexandria used the term gnosis and initiation. And so I think even within Alexandrian Christianity, the so-called Orthodox world, you may also find that distinction. You have like new Christians and then initiates that are a bit further along. And I think they had maybe some version of that as well.
Awesome. Well, you want to talk now about the Gospel of Thomas and what you're going to talk about?
Yeah. The Gospel of Thomas, I think of as a text not just read by the Gnostics, but by other groups too. It's quoted by Syrian Christian mystics. There's a saying of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas that's quoted by St. Augustine.
Oh, really? Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think Thomas...
What's the saying? You can get the boy out of the Gnosticism, but you can't get the Gnosticism out of the boy.
I've got it right. It's such a neat thing it kind of throws
for the audience, Augustine was a Manichaean, and he went to Catholicism, but both friend and foe still claim that he never changed his stripes. Really, it was all a play. But anyway, go ahead, James.
Yeah. It's just I love quoting this because it throws a glitch into the matrix of orthodoxy, because sometimes these folks that are claimed by orthodoxy aren't quite as orthodox as like St. Pachomius and up there near Nag Hammadi, for instance. Yeah, against the adversary of the law and the prophets, 2:4:14, St. Augustine. But when the apostles asked what should be thought about the prophets of the Jews who were thought to have sung something in the past about his coming, he was disturbed that they should still think such things, and replied, quote, "You have abandoned the living one who is before you and are talking about the dead." And that is Gospel of Thomas saying 52. His disciples said to him, 24 prophets spoke in Israel, and did all of them speak about you? He said to them, you have neglected the living one in front of you and spoken of the dead. So I think Augustine was a reader of Thomas. Now the Gospel of Thomas turns up, Origen of Alexandria quoted it, Clement of Alexandria quoted, there's a bunch of, I've got them in my notes here. Let's see, Oxyrhynchus Thomas, let the one seeking not stop seeking until he finds, and when he finds he will marvel, and marveling he will reign, and reigning he will rest. And that turns up a couple of times in Clement of Alexandria. Macarius of Egypt, the saying about from, what is it, saying 113, the kingdom of God is spread out upon the earth, but people don't see it. Macarius of Syria quotes that in his writing. So it's just neat to see that. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 2 was battling with the wisdom Christians, which I think is another term for the Thomas Christians who like parables and sayings a lot. And he quotes something that resembles saying 17, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, and what has never occurred to the mind of man, that I will give you. That is in the Gospel of Thomas, it's in Manichaean and Mandaean scriptures, it's in apocryphal gospels attributed to Jesus and two other New Testament gospels. It's in the Quran eventually too. It's quoted in the Quran, that saying. That's a very popular saying that pops up now and then. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the saying about what is it, seeking and finding, that turns up, the saying from the Gospel of Thomas is attributed to the Gospel of the Hebrews in the writings of Clement of Alexandria. And so I think there's some overlap there. And I want to mention saying 12 of the Gospel of Thomas says, wherever you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into existence. And so for me, that makes the Gospel of Thomas part of that Ebionite Jewish Christian realm. And there may be some other sayings that were added to the Gospel of Thomas that we have from the Coptic that came from elsewhere. But I think the core of Thomas goes back to Q, the source gospel material, and that Thomas tradition. So I would say
and
Thomas.
It should be mentioned too, again, as we try to understand why these groups decided to go vegetarian or not. We talked about compassion, reincarnation, maybe preparing meat, but for the Gospel of Thomas and maybe the Ebionites too, it was to return to an Edenic state, right? To do everything
Yes.
you could to get back in time, lift the veil of this illusion, whoever put this illusion, error, the demiurge, and get back to the Garden of Eden, which obviously man and animal lived in peace.
Yes, that's an important key point. Mystic paths that have that present tense kingdom of God, and Thomas is in that camp. The kingdom of God is right now. We don't have, it's not up there in the sky, in the by and by. We don't have to wait for it to come with signs to be observed. It's a present tense reality. And so people that embrace that tend to think of that as the return to paradise, return to Eden. And groups like that include the diet of Eden as part of their spirituality. So yes, that is very much at the heart of a lot of this, I think, mystical tradition, and to get back to Eden, get back to that lost original realm. And yeah, that's one of the things. They become vegetarian. Yeah, that's part of that's I'm glad you thought of that, because that's a key part of the psychology, I think, with a lot of these mystic groups, and prophecies of the future too, helping Isaiah out. In the future, Isaiah talks about the ideal is a vegetarian utopia. And some people say, okay, Isaiah, let's do this. Why wait?
He talks about the wolf and the lamb laying down together. Although, of course, people say with the Mandela effect, it used to be the lion and the lamb laying down together. I always thought it was the lion and the lamb laying down together. What about you, Nate? What did you? Wasn't it
the lamb lays down over Broadway?
That's Genesis. And getting back to the garden, that's that song Woodstock by God, who was the name of the singer?
Yeah.
Yes. I think she did Yellow Taxi. Is that the one who did it? Oh my God, I'm forgetting too. And then it was covered by the Trio. Oh my God, I'm drawing a blank. I must have coronavirus because I'm forgetting, or anti-gnosis, or
back to the garden. Yeah, that is definitely a Gnostic theme, and a mystic theme. Lie down with the cat. I'm hearing a cat now. So.
Yes, the cat. Hold on, I have to let the cat out. Hold on. Oh, no, I've got the dog bothering me. 1 second, guys.
This is just a random moment to give love to animals. Part of Gnosis is real, actual heaven right now, as we're saying. And that's what animals are. So, back to the show and such.
All right. Well, we know the dog will lie down with the cat. They're
Yes,
friends,
exactly.
but cat wants to go out.
Yes.
But anyway, we're getting. Oh, there you go, Joni Mitchell. Thank you,
Joni Mitchell.
Superfluous Pastry, and then Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young. Oh my God!
Yes, ding, ding, ding. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I wanted to put in a word for the a good word for the Ebionites, because they are, I think, the bridge between Christianity and some later Gnostic movements, Elkasites to Manichaean, for instance. And so here you have James the Just, who is called the brother of Jesus by everyone. And he's described as a vegetarian, and saying 12 Gospel of Thomas, he becomes the leader of this group. Robert Eisenman has a book on James the Just, and St. Augustine once again said that James the Just was vegetarian. And he becomes the leader of the church that Paul gets to fight with, there early on. There are references. I have a list of them in my e-booklet to Thomas being vegetarian, James the Just being vegetarian, John being vegetarian, John the Baptist, the other John, also being vegetarian, Peter being very staunchly vegetarian. And so people may ask the question, if you have a vegetarian religion based in Jerusalem headed by Jesus's brother, can that mean also that Jesus himself was a vegetarian? Because in what world do you have a religion founded by a meat-eating Messiah that goes veg? It just, something's not quite adding up there.
Yeah, I know you have an answer, but yes, he's got the fish, the multiplying of the fish, the Passover meal. What is going on with that, James?
What is going on with that? Well, you have dueling gospel traditions, like Buddhism has dueling sutras, some in a veg camp and others coming from a pro-meat camp. And in Christianity, you have dueling gospel traditions. You have gospels that the followers of Paul eventually adopted as sacred scripture, the ones we're familiar with in the Roman and European world, Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism now, Greek Orthodoxy. But the Ebionites had their own gospels. And in those gospels, Jesus didn't eat the Passover lamb. John the Baptist didn't eat locusts, but locust beans or carob. And the apostles, whatever they used to be up to, some of them probably were fishermen hanging out in good old Galilee. But the Sunday school notion of, the disciples opening up a fish market in Galilee, and years and years and years go by and they're still selling fish and involved in fish, that apparently isn't true. If you read the Ebionite writings, like the Clementine homilies, for instance, these guys became vegetarians, and you can list almost all of the apostles as saying that they were vegetarian. Thomas, in the Acts of Thomas, mentions being a vegetarian. So they were very vegetarian, and they were fighting with Paul over diet. So Paul is actually our earliest witness to the vegetarianism of the Jesus movement, because he's fighting with them in the New Testament, and his letters date between 53 and 57 AD. And that's pretty early. That's earlier than the Gospels. So they had their own Gospels: Gospel of the Ebionites, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Nazareans. And those writings are quoted by some of the early church fathers. They're mostly gone, mostly lost text, except for the quotes found in the early church fathers. But some of those early church fathers seem to not only have had those writings, but were influenced by them, like Hieronymus. Can I read that? There's if I can scroll
Yeah, please
down,
do.
because these folks, some of the early church fathers that had access to, well, I can click on this one here. St. Peter, the Apostle Matthew partook of seeds and nuts, hard-shelled fruits and vegetables without flesh. Clement of Alexandria. In my ebook, I've got a whole list of these things. James was the veg. All the apostles. James, the brother of Jesus, lived on seeds and vegetables and did not accept meat or wine. St. Augustine. And then Hieronymus, also known as Jerome, St. Jerome, once said, "The consumption of animal flesh was unknown up until the Great Flood. But since the Great Flood, we have had animal flesh stuffed into our mouths. Jesus the Christ, who appeared when the time was fulfilled, again, joined the end to the beginning, so that we are now no longer allowed to eat animal flesh." Saint Jerome, or Hieronymus, who apparently read the Gospel of the Hebrews and sounded like he totally, embraced that. Origen of Alexandria was a vegetarian. Saint Basil the Great, "The steam of meat meals darkens the spirit. One can hardly have virtue if one enjoys meat meals and feasts. In the earthly paradise, or Eden, no one sacrificed animals and no one ate meat." So that Orthodox church fathers, were advocating vegetarianism, and some of them quoted the Gospel of the Hebrews. I would say, just briefly, that if anyone wishes they could access the Ebionite Jewish Christianity that got wiped out so long ago, Paul argued against them and marginalized them, gave James a teeny epistle at the end of the New Testament. Usually the elders get to sit up front or on the stage. James was in the back of the bus there, back of the New Testament next to Jude. So I would say the Gospel of Thomas, the reconstructed attempts at Q, the Odes of Solomon, which isn't really by Solomon, but a collection of very Jewish Christian hymns, psalms of the first century, and a huge collection of surviving Ebionite writings would be something called the Clementine Homilies and the Recognitions of Clement. That is a huge body of literature that has not been stamped out, not been wiped out by orthodoxy. And it presents, it's like a giant, I think one of your earlier guests called it a Ebionite Book of Acts. It's a huge collection of Ebionite writings, pro-vegetarian writings, and just look for the Clementine Homilies. That's the one that has made it to the 21st century unscathed. Whereas the Gospel of the Hebrews, there's only a few quotes, kicked around by Epiphanius and, the early church historian, Eusebius, I think his name was, quotes it.
Right. Wonderful. And yes, again, for those of you who joined late, we've got James Bean, and we're talking about vegetarianism and Gnosticism, ancient religion. We're keeping it historical. I know it's gotten a little lively in the chat room with people giving their issues, and that's fine. Everybody should have a perspective, and it's all good. Nate, do you see any questions, or do you have a question for James, my friend?
Holy Gavolts, let me see if I can get this. Because the Eastern tradition would obviously probably approach us like, so let's just bring it just for the Western mysteries. It seems that the Christ figure, when in that quote, was talking about that he made it so that we couldn't eat meat, because I was immediately struck by that he's talking after the flood. Whenever you hear that, and so I was wondering, was this a result of, without going into Nephilim and genetics and tampering, or maybe we should, maybe Christ was the thing, or some kind of one of the many metaphors for Christ that made it so that that meat eating was, his sacrifice made it that it was once again, now we don't need to do the Aztec. Now we don't need to eat the animal. I was looking in this old one of the sacred texts, and it talks about certain meats that are good for the body, positive air being as positive for the vital life force, and you draw air into your lungs, and most of us don't breathe well, really need to clean out yourself all the time. And then the food itself being of a negative, and the drink being of a negative. But basically, um I'm just wondering if the crucifixion is some kind of metaphor for the, cessation of the need to eat the flesh, so, because this thing was talking about horse meat. So, just wondering.
Well, for some, yeah, the sacrifice of Christ negates the old system, the Jewish sacrifices. Of course, they were already against sacrifices, but yeah, that plays into even mainstream Christianity. The sacrifice of Christ means no longer the need for animal sacrifice in the Jewish temple. And Hieronymus, that quote I shared earlier from Hieronymus or Saint Jerome, that Christ came and now we don't need to eat meat. That is an Ebionite point of view that he is espousing there about the role of Christ. And yeah, there's no need for sacrifice. I'm not sure that they really believed in sacrifice anyway. uh, in fact, Jesus, the story of the turning the tables of the money changers over in the Gospel of John, we think of that as being about money changing, but there were a lot of animals involved in sacrifice in the temple of Jerusalem, and he actually lets loose these animals, and then he's crucified after that. So in that story, animals that would have been sacrificed in the temple are let loose, and that was the final straw before the crucifixion. And
Yeah, according to the synoptics, yeah, I think in the Gospel of John, it's bringing back Lazarus from the dead that gets him.
that gets them. That's just one step too far.
Yeah, necromancy. But yeah, the synoptics is the temple.
The temple.
Overturning.
Yeah, and we think of that as being about money and money changers, but he cracks the whip and drives out the animals, and Keith Akers in his writings, really kind of focuses on that as being about animal liberation, and that was the final straw, that was taken on the priesthood running the temple, and then Jesus gets arrested and executed, and that is really practicing resistance against temple sacrifice. When you're actually letting animals out, that is going against the system.
It is indeed, and it should be mentioned too, I believe it's the prophet Jeremiah who complains about animal sacrifice in the Old Testament. So
Yeah,
there was these struggles even within Judaism, within the temple, of what should we do. It wasn't cut and dry, if you would.
Yeah, the whole basis for Essene Judaism, I mean, it's kind of a segue, a kind of a growth or evolution in Judaism. And yeah, that was going on centuries prior to the time of Christ and the Ebionites, this evolution away from literal sacrifices and kind of spiritualizing that and having a sacrifice of praise and prayer and making it an inward and spiritual sort of thing instead of a literal animal sacrifice sort of thing.
Indeed. And I guess, what about the Nag Hammadi library itself?
Yes.
Why don't we go, what are some instances that promotes vegetarianism?
Well, specifically, there is, and I've got it somewhere in my notes here. The prayer of thanksgiving, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, one of the Gnostic Gospels found in December of 1945 by Muhammad Ali El-Saman, discovering this clay jar containing Coptic papyri. The prayer of thanksgiving has this beautiful prayer, and then at the end it says, when they had said these things in the prayer, they embraced each other, and they went to eat their holy food, which has no blood in it. And in the Gnostic scriptures, the Marvin Meyer translation of the Nag Hammadi, he has a footnote. Vegetarian food was his footnote there. Now, that same prayer found in the Nag Hammadi library that ends with this vegetarian reference about a kind of a love feast, communal meal, vegetarian communal meal. That same passage is also found in the epilogue of Asclepius in the Corpus Hermeticum. And so here are some other alternate translations of that same ending of the prayer. Sir Walter Scott, having prayed thus, let us betake ourselves to a meal unpolluted by flesh of living things. G.R.S. Mead translation. With this desire we now betake to our pure and fleshless meal. And finally, the Brian Copenhaver translation of Hermetica renders it, with such hopes we turn to a pure meal that includes no living thing. So that's in the Nag Hammadi and in the Hermetic tradition. So I'm not sure if it's I guess the prayer of thanksgiving is a Hermetic text popular with Gnostics, and thus it ends up in both collections, the Nag Hammadi scriptures and the Hermetica. And that would be the rock solid example of a vegetarian text studied by Gnostics.
Any other examples? Gospel of Thomas? Anything else that we can say besides the whole theology of going back to Eden?
The sentences of Sextus, the Pythagorean, is included also in the Nag Hammadi.
Yeah, it was very popular all across the Roman Empire too. It was a popular text.
Yeah, it was read by different groups, and so that prayer of thanksgiving would be the specific example of a Gnostic text earlier than the Manichaeans. Now, of course, the Manichaeans were known to be vegetarian. I think they had, like we talked about earlier, a system where the perfected were all vegetarian. The inner circle of Manichaean Gnostics were, but they also had an outer circle of regular folks that probably were not all vegetarians, and that's how the Manichaeans operated. So the Manichaeans are known to be vegetarian, but only if you sign up for the full program, the full initiation into the mysteries. And that's actually how it is in Saint Mott, just to bring in my spiritual path once again. In order to qualify for initiation, you have to be a lacto-vegetarian, no eggs or meat or fish or fowl as a requirement for initiation, which is just another way of saying learning the meditation practice.
Yeah, interesting. And of course, the Cathars kind of borrowed the same system. The Bogomils maybe through the Cathars, where you had hearers and perfects, and perfects, and the perfect with the Cathars were also vegetarian. Yes,
they seem to be thought of as kind of neo-Manichaeans, or somehow connected to a remnant of Manichaeanism in France, and from I guess Eastern Europe was a previous hangout for Manichaeanism in Europe, Bulgaria and in that region. But yeah, the Cathars of France were kind of neo-Manichaean, apparently.
Indeed, they were. And I'd like to get to this question that 100th Monkey did, since it's in the super chat. I'm sure you can answer this one, James, a little on the side. And it goes, how do you get complete proteins as a vegan without soy?
Easy, just grains and beans. In the same day, soy is complete. Also split peas, which I happen to like a lot and tend to buy by the bag. Those are a complete protein as well, all of the protein. But it's good to, if you're following a plant-based diet, to have multiple sources, have some beans. Beans are very essential. Without beans, it would be hard to be vegetarian. But yeah, beans and grains, whole grains preferably, whole wheat macaroni, brown rice, oats, and some kind of bean, and you're totally covered. For B12, have some nutritional yeast. I love the taste of nutritional yeast. It complements the flavor of things. And, then you've got your B12 and you're all set,
And that's almost ironic because I know from the work that Richard Smalley did, and he shared on the show that the Pythagoreans would not eat beans because it was
devastating.
It's because when he went to for some reason, the Egyptians, when he did the Egyptian mysteries, they were against beans. So the Pythagoras was like, oh, take that off of our menu.
That's really ironic because that's the magical fruit.
Yeah, I have heard that also. I've heard that also about the Pythagoreans, that they were for some weird reason against beans, and that would be very devastating. But of course, a lot of these references, someone ate carob beans, Peter ate olives and bread. I mean, none of these things sound like a healthy diet. I mean, of course, they didn't live maybe very long, but yeah, you need to have some D3, Peter, and supplement with B12.
Go to your nutrition. Go to Whole Foods if you can afford
Whole Foods
it,
of Israel, or Whole Foods of Nazareth, and do some supplementation a little bit and have a balanced diet. Get some kale too. Green things are good, So my go-to source for information on diet is a site called nutritionfacts.org. It's Dr. Michael Greger. He does all of these reports about medical studies, double-blind studies about the effects of kale and beet juice to lower blood pressure, and all of these things about the hibiscus tea, green tea, and antiviral properties, antioxidants that are lower in the inflammatory condition that's responsible for a lot of our diseases. I can't get enough.
What's the site again?
Nutritionfacts.org.
Okay.
That is my vegan med MD, medical MD. That's where I get a lot of inspiration from, because it's very scientific based.
Nutrition Facts. I'm putting it here.
Yeah.
Nutritionfacts.org, so I can bookmark it and see if I can get some good dope on all this stuff, as I'm always looking for things to tweak the diet and everything else. And I know somebody in the room also asked if Plato was vegetarian, or any of those Greek philosophers beyond Plato. What do you think, James?
I am not sure. I wouldn't be surprised, if Plotinus or some of these philosophers were. But I no authority. I'm not really sure about that. When you get into the Greek philosophers, there've always been veg movements. There have been veg movements in Judaism, in the pagan world, in Christianity. Not too long ago, the Seventh-day Adventists were, got going. So there's always been in most societies, veg movements. Even within even in evangelical Christianity, there's some veg movements. Christian Vegetarian Society, I think, is the name of one. So there's always someone who's vegetarian in every religion, in every culture. There are vegan Muslims. There are vegan
Wow.
Sikhs, and
Oh, Sikhs. Wow.
yeah, there's vegans everywhere, organized in each of the world religions. There's a guy by the name of Keith Akers who is sort of the Christian Marvin Meyer, kind of the Christian vegan Marvin Meyer, or Robert Eisenman, who specializes in these questions. What about the loaves with the fishes? And, in tackling all of these questions. And he makes a pretty persuasive case that Jesus was a vegetarian. There is a saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke that is vegetarian in the Aramaic Syriac manuscript of the Gospel of Luke, where he talks about flesh eating, as a bad thing. But it's not in the Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. It's gone. And so what he's saying, and I agree with him, that the Gospels that we have are a little bit edited, with meat added to the menu in a couple of cases, to push against the original Jesus movement, to win the argument by changing history itself. but revising history, it comes in pretty handy, and Christians have been very good about that, and so he advocates that Jesus was a vegetarian, and points out that if James the Just, Jesus's brother, was vegetarian, in what universe do parents raise one kid to be vegetarian from birth, but they're not veg, and this other sibling, Jesus, they're going to feed him meat? I don't think that doesn't make sense. So basically, Keith Akers was saying in his lectures on the subject that if James the Just was vegetarian, probably his parents were too, and probably
Well,
all
maybe
the
Jesus
family.
converted to Christianity when he was young.
Yeah, maybe so.
He said, I'm going to worship myself. That's
Yeah.
it.
Somehow there, it makes more sense. And so I think our texts are a little tampered with. Some of the early church fathers talk about the feeding of the 5,000 as just being about bread without mentioning the fish. Why is that? Maybe they hadn't added fish to the Greek manuscripts yet. So I think there's some outright tampering. But I think that Luke chapter 21 is the most spectacular example, where in the Aramaic Syriac, Jesus has a vegetarian saying against eating of flesh. But it's not there in the Greek. So that just to me seems like, wow, it's gone. It's been de-vegged. Who did that? Why did they do that?
Yeah, well, again, history is written by the victors, as Vance like to say, holy books are written by the vicars.
Yes, and John the Baptist being turned into a locust eater. There's two Greek words. I can't pronounce either of them, but one means locust as an insect, and the other means locust bean as in the carob. And the Gospel of the Ebionites, as quoted by Epiphanius, the church father, talks about John the Baptist being a Bert, what's his name? Ehrman. Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman, yeah.
Talks about that too. The John the Baptist group was vegetarian, and John ate flour made from carob beans.
Mm-hmm.
But the translators, for some weird reason, translated it as locusts, as in eating insects.
I think a lot of it they wanted to dumb down. I mean, if we look outside, John the Baptist was probably a very intellectual, philosophical. He was a community leader. He was, but of course, he had to be dumbed down into some knuckle dragging guy with furs and kind of crazy in the wilderness. But the real John the Baptist was probably a very sophisticated thinker and probably a pretty good guy.
Yeah, that is true. There's always the politics of one religion to the next. Paul marginalizes the Jesus movement because they are sort of in his way. The John the Baptist group was much more popular than Christianity for a while. And so they've got to be brought down so that any of my disciples are greater than John. You know, that's a paraphrase of a saying from the New Testament. And yeah, so John can't be too looming large as a figure, even though John the Baptist is sort of Jesus's guru or spiritual master. You know, he followed John, took baptism or initiation from him. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of distancing that goes on. And then, of course, the missing 12 years, you know, having Jesus sit at the feet of a rabbi just makes Jesus too human. And so there's this missing gap where you don't really hear about Jesus growing up and learning, sitting at the feet of rabbis, and, you know, because that makes him too human. So that's the missing years.
That is indeed. And any questions from yourself, Nate, or the audience, as they're pretty lively down there in the desert of the real, as you keep calling it?
I got that from somewhere. I can't remember. So yeah, a quick question, and then I have two from the chat. There's a lot of moving through the heavens or the spheres in Gnosticism, especially with the liberation of thought. And it seems like, you know, when you want to look at this right beyond like good and evil, is there just a practical way of, like, we're called carnivores. The Latin is like the same for carnivorous, to eat, and you're an incarnation. So we've all heard this, I'm sure, but just to remind us, you're adding more flesh to the flesh. So resonance wise, without any kind of like good or evil to it, it's just bad consciousness science. So I just wanted to like see what you thought about that. And also big ups to Superfluous Pastry, who mentioned Adam Hart Mother. Yes, the cows are on that because they wanted to the Stromtherm. I'm not gonna even try right now. It was his birthday the other. They said they want to do the least psychedelic thing possible. What happens when cows poop?
I don't know. They destroy the environment.
The methane footprint.
Right.
That was actually, there was a joke. It was the least psychedelic. Anyways, I wanted to make that point. We have a great question about well, I like it, but whatever. 11D Levity says, did Bulgarian Manichaeism descend from Orphic tradition? And then we have one of the more kind of vegetarian history only ones. I have noticed many Gnostics are fans of Saint Francis Assisi, who was known to be kind to animals, if I remember right. Roman. So
yeah, I'm not sure what the diet of Saint Francis was, but I would not be utterly shocked if he was veg. There is a veg tradition within, like, for instance, the monasteries of even Catholicism. I think they're most of the time vegetarian, or they may, you know, practice a thing where they are vegetarian except, you know, during holidays, or if they're feeling ill and want to up their protein temporarily, maybe that's, but otherwise they're veg. I think that's the monastic tradition.
It's not, yeah, it's really not uncommon in Catholicism. My mother-in-law, she was a devout Catholic, rarely ate meat. My mom would go on some vow and would spend 40 days and no meat. So yeah, it's their medieval Catholicism, medieval Christianity. Yeah, it's a lot more common than what people would say or know.
Yeah, even within Orthodoxy and the Syriacs. I'm a real fan of the Syriac Eastern mystics. They have a couple more rungs on the divine ladder of ascent, you know, some more mystical techniques. And they are sort of an influence on the Sufis, and they were veg. The monastics are usually veg. The mystics usually are veg. And yeah, I think there is a psychology of not wanting to add to the flesh. And for those who believe in karma, yeah, just an added weight or a heavier vibration from flesh. So I think that's part of it as well, you know, for these groups, you know.
What about you talk about Buddhists who eat meat. And yeah, when I was a Buddhist and I would go to this temple, Mahayana temple, Tibetan temple, Don Mountain in Houston, they would bring out meals, the priests, and it was full of meat. And I never asked questions because I was eating meat at the time, so I didn't want to mess with the karma. But what's the rationale with Buddhists eating meat, the meat
Yeah,
side?
yeah. I'm not too fluent in Buddhism. I will say that the Sringama Sutra is my favorite Buddhist text, and that text is one of the earliest texts in all of human history to advocate veganism. I mean, even wearing wool and whatnot, is discouraged for. So there is a vegan or veg tradition within Buddhism, but I'm not sure who's following it. The Sringama Sutra is a really interesting Buddhist text. It's kind of similar to the Pistis Sophia of the Gnostics in that it's written probably later. Maybe it's a channeled Buddha, if you will, like you have a channeled Jesus and Pistis Sophia. And it's considered an apocryphal, esoteric text only followed by a few people, like Pistis Sophia. William Blake may have liked it, and a few people have liked it from time to time. But yeah, kind of out of the mainstream. And so, yeah, the vegetarianism or even veganism in the case of the Sringama Sutra is kind of a representing the teachings of a defunct form of Buddhism that mostly has disappeared or only stayed in Asia. There are a lot of, and hence the China study, there are Chinese and Taiwanese folks that are vegetarian. It's kind of an old tradition there, but yeah, not everyone is following that, in China and in Buddhism. Buddhism has many different sects.
And in Hinduism too, I think northern Hindus do eat meat towards the Himalayas and other areas.
There are some, as you get closer to Islam, there's some that eat meat, in the northwestern part of India. There's a higher percentage of vegetarians in India, of course, and Hinduism is veg. But yeah, not everyone in India is veg. There are a lot of Muslims who live in India, and some Buddhists, and to the north, and Tibet. Of course, the Tibetan Buddhists are not veg either. They have some pretty esoteric traditions, but yeah, they're not necessarily veg. Yeah, dueling gospels, once again, dueling sutras. You have, like, in one, the Buddha says, you've got to be veg, and in order to get to nirvana. And then you've got others that have Buddha eating pork, and then he dies. That's the last thing he supposedly ate was pork, and then that's it. He dies, poisoned pork.
Oh, it was poison. I thought he just choked on it by accident.
Yeah, you
anticlimactic.
Right. Yeah.
You're the savior of the universe, and that's how you go.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think how it works with some of these religions, and this is true of Christianity, you have like an esoteric movement started by some mystic, and it's veg, like Rumi. Rumi is vegan. There are verses of Rumi that talk about him not even consuming milk products. And Rabia of Basra was a Sufi and was veg. I think these groups start off, the Ebionite Christians, the poor, the original remnant of Jesus's movement, they start off veg. The Sikh religion founded by Guru Nanak started off as veg. But, people show up. The Romans from the Roman Empire want in on it. The ranks swell with the masses from China, from the Muslim world, with their halal diet coming along, or the Romans with their fish and their, meat-eating ways. And they join a religion, and they bring their diet with them. And so thus you can have a vegetarian religion like the Jesus movement be turned into, something that sounds anti-veg, a meat-eating Messiah. And if you have a meat-eating Messiah, why be veg, right? Jesus ate meat in their view, in their opinion. And so therefore, end of discussion, so to speak.
Yeehaw. And actually, Brett Perlman has a very good question. If animals have the spark, humans have the spark, do plants have the spark? And the answer is yes. At least according to the Manichaeans, in the inner circle, they were as hardcore as the Jains. In other words, they would not eat plants unless the plant would drop fruit from its trees. They thought there was light in everything, including plants, and they were trying to break that wheel of karma, the Manichaeans as well as the Jains. So yes, the plants. So yes, you can go even more hardcore than veganism. You can go Manichaeanism.
You can go Manichaean.
Yeah, that's the ultimate. I guess the breatharians would be the ultimate hardcore guys, right?
Yeah, the breatharians are pretty hardcore, and
breatharians are softcore.
they are. I don't know if I even believe in the existence of breatharians. I think they secretly eat junk food behind the 7-Eleven when no one's looking. In fact, there's who I forget the name of the guy. There was like a famous breatharian who was caught eating junk food out back of the 7-Eleven.
Really? Oh,
and that's,
okay.
I think it's at Wikipedia. I laughed so hard. I think it's the hardest laugh I've ever had after this guy was found out to actually eat food and not a breatharian. So I'm very agnostic when it comes to breatharianism, I must say, because we need food, we need water in order to live. And that's always been a good thing, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Yeah, very much. But yes, for your answer, Brett, is yes. The Manichaeans would have seen there is light in every plant. Mine even said there's light in every rock. Complete pacifist, complete. Despite their nasty dualistic porn mythology, the Manichaeans were the most eco-friendly, pacifist group in the world, and they were able to bring a world religion being so nice. The problem is they couldn't defend themselves.
That's the thing.
It ended badly.
Yeah, like
but the people loved them. It was the governments that weren't so kind.
Yeah, like the Tibetans in China. They didn't have an army to stand up. But if they did, they wouldn't be the same people, would they? They would be these warrior Tibetan Buddhists, and they wouldn't be the same, they wouldn't have the same spirituality. So on the diet, in India, they teach that the more complicated the life, the more pain, they can feel and whatnot, there's more karma in consuming them. And so the option is we have to eat something. Unless you're a breatharian, we have to eat something. And so there's less karma eating plants than animals. And so they have a system of kind of a philosophical, tier of, lesser conscious beings, less karma, and that's the least harm we can do. But there is still the belief that there is some karma in eating plants too, just less karma.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we are getting towards the end. Nate, do you have a final question or comment? I see you waving the book.
I have
throw the book at us.
Question. My computer won't take that tonight, dude. I gotta give the shout out, to No Agenda and go. I got hands, dun, 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 dun. I ate bugs, all of that jazz. So, anyways, I got
no sleeping in no pod. I ain't eating no bugs.
Locusts.
Right. Yeah, well, dipped in honey. So it says right here, Pythagoras was also an infallible teacher, like the present occupant of the Vatican. Just don't worry about this. And no dog dared bark when his mouth was opened. The college was divided into two classes, the exoterics and the esoterics, and the latter alone formed the real members of his order. The brethren resided in large houses or buildings with their wives and children. Their labors were dearly apportioned, and a settlement was made every night. The curriculum comprehended a study of Homer and Hesiod, gymnastic and athletic sports, and exercises worthy of manly skill. Their food consisted mainly of bread, honey, and water.
Wow.
That was worth mentioning.
Yeah, it sounds like the John the Baptist diet.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and that's the whole here perfect kind of system. Started with the Pythagoras, the esoteric and the exoteric. Those who are ready and those who are just sort of not ready. Tap dancing.
Yeah, I do wish that there'd be more texts found, and so that we would get more of a description of, Valentinian lifestyle, like that passage you just read, or Philo describing the Therapeutae, their housing arrangement and meeting schedule. I wish we could do that for the Valentinians and the Sethians, how they organized, how they conducted themselves, what their worship services were like, or meditations, and a little bit more of that description of the daily life of these folks.
Yeah, I mean, we do have Marcus the magician and April Deconic and others. It was probably very much an Egyptian style where you had lodges and you had one guru or New Age Tony Robbins who was the leader. And if you liked him, you just moved to the next one, and very anarchist. And again, as with Marcus the magician, maybe they took turns, they changed it, but small, intimate, and very very personal. Sharing your feelings, sharing your visions. Everybody had a place to talk and contribute. So that's, I think, the best we have. And of course, then the different rituals, whatever they were.
Right, and there's examples of vowel chant in some of those Gnostic texts. And April Deconic.
Contemplation, meditation, altered states of mind, a whole bunch of,
April Deconic, I forget the name of the book, but it's through E.J. Brill, which has all of this good stuff, all of these scholarly books. They're very expensive, though. It's if the binding is made of titanium. They're all like $100, $200. But I think she has a book on the spiritual practices, as best she has been able to discern, of some of these groups.
I think it's Voices of the Mystics.
Something like that. Yeah, it's an E.J. Brill book by April Deconic on the techniques, the chanting and meditating and group worship. I think she's tried to figure that out and piece that together.
Yeah, well, there's so much still we have to learn, and again, you've brought a lot more since our last interview 4.5 years ago, and we're glad for it. But yes, we are at the end. Thank you very much for those of you who attended the chat. I hope we answered your questions, Nate and I, and James. As always, this show will be on YouTube, the complete show, right after this ends. But I will have an audio version for the entire world on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, all the podcast providers. Yes, there will be audio. Members, AB Prime members and patrons will get the full dope. Everybody else will get a smaller size. And please support this podcast. I can't do it without you. You will not find these guests and great Gnostic content anywhere else on the internets or meat space or anywhere else space. And but I am truly blessed to bring you this kind of content. Of course, support James. James, you also have a podcast and a website, so I will have this on the show notes. So please tell the audience about your work, where they can find it.
Yeah, I have at YouTube a channel called Sant Mat Radhaswamy. But if you just go to the YouTube search box and type in James Bean Spiritual Awakening Radio, you'll just come to it. And I do podcasts on Sant Mat. It's like you do, podcasts, but at YouTube and also other sites. And I do Sant Mat, but I've done some programs on the Gospel of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, and in fact, my most popular shows, I think, are Gospel of Thomas and one on Mary Magdalene. I do a certain amount of programs on Christian mysticism, which does exist and is a thing, as I've said before. There's a few. Like the Syriacs and those medieval Meister Eckhart, and there's a few of those refugees from Christianity that were mystics and had some interesting things to say, and get a lot of respect in India, even though in the West they're like, ooh, the evil, you know. They're not respected. I wrote an article once even called if you don't want your saints and mystics, we'll take them. And it was about all these Christian mystics that are quoted in India with great respect, but in the West they're like, yeah, who cares about those guys?
Oh, so it is. So awesome. Well, yeah, check out James's work. I enjoy his podcast. I enjoy his YouTube channel. Watch it when I can. So thank you, audience. And Nate, truly appreciate you keeping us company and basically driving this ship of fools.
Man, I don't know if you call that driving, but thanks for having James and I and you. And hey, you know, you are I and I are all to come together right now. Insert Beatles reference here. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, always great to have you, and really enjoyed it. And last but not least, and hopefully you won't be behind a 7-Eleven eating meat after this podcast, James. But
no, I'm gonna cook some beans, some dark red kidney beans. They're like one of the highest antioxidant of the beans. So
I'll keep that in mind. I've got the website, but truly appreciate having you on again. And we look forward to our next discussion. Thanks for coming to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, or AB Live to be more exact.
My pleasure.
Enjoyed it too. Well, thank you, audience. And as I always like to say, thanks for being here. Thanks for being yourself, your true self. Hello and goodbye as always. Okay.